share best practice and approaches to reducing energy demand and decarbonation. The conference will also highlight innovative technologies and best practice for scaling up renewable energy in the region. One of the main challenges facing the Caribbean in transitioning to renewable energy is because of the lack of resources and infrastructure. The government of Aruba will present solutions to transition to a sustainable energy future. The Caribbean Climate and Energy Conference 2023 will provide a platform for discussing the latest projects and business opportunities related to renewable energy in the Caribbean. The conference will also focus on the importance of scaling up global investments for climate adaptation and mitigation. With the help of conferences like this, the Caribbean can continue to make progress towards a sustainable energy future. Distinguished guests, welcome to the Caribbean Climate and Energy Conference 2023. It is an honor for Aruba to host such an eventful conference. We would like to invite on stage this morning Minister Glambert Cruz, Minister of Labor, Energy and Integration. Minister Cruz is here to share the cutting-edge energy solutions and the opportunities they present for Aruba and the Caribbean region. He is eager to discuss the potential of renewable energy, sources of the impact it will have on Aruba, and the region's economy.
Good morning. Bon dia. Buenos dias. Bon dia. Madam Prime Minister, esteemed colleague, Minister Yetten, esteemed colleagues of the government of Aruba, esteemed colleagues from different parts of the kingdom and different parts from the Caribbean, distinguished guests, invitees, special recognition to our students today with us of vocational education. For me, it's an honor on this last day of the Caribbean Climate Energy Conference to share a couple of words with you. I'm not going to speak much. They gave me 3 minutes to say something. I'll try to stay within the time limit because this is a day of action. And we will be judged during this climate conference by our words, but we're going to be judged by our actions. And we would like for our actions to speak louder than our words by letting the experts today make their presentations. But I want to share a couple of thoughts over these last 3 days with you. I think something very special is born with this conference. What COP means to the world and United Nations, I believe Ccec 23, the Caribbean Climate Energy Conference, will mean for the region. When we appreciate to see important international institutions, we're very happy to see big countries like the United States, the Netherlands, Spain, Mexico. I mean, there's many big countries, Barbados, their institutions. We are very happy to see Belize, pardon me for Trinidad. When you start mentioning names, you fall into problems. But colleagues from all the way from the Marshall Islands came to Aruba. That says a lot. And thinking about these last 3 days, I believe that during our kingdom session, I told them, I believe that our conference, we can inspire the world. You know, small countries, sometimes we are small, but we dream big. But sometimes big dreams need to start with small steps. Start small and expand. And I think that is what we're doing with this conference. I think this conference can be a big voice of hope for the world. And I think we will keep positive pressure on other countries to walk the talk. Failure is not an option for us. We've just experienced as the world COVID-19, the pandemic. Look how the world came together. We don't have a choice to let this be a catastrophe like the pandemic. Because if it reaches that point, it will be too late. So, but we can inspire the world. And during our kingdom session, I cited a very important moment in history that inspired the whole world. And it is described by this phrase, one small step for man, one giant leap for humanity, for mankind. That was the exact words of Neil Armstrong when he took the first steps on the moon. Look how much has been spent, dedicated to getting to know the outer space. One thing we can say, probably, instead of seeking so much answers in outer space, should we not dedicate more efforts on our own planet? We need to save our planet in order for our planet to save us. We need to protect nature in order for nature to protect us. We need to preserve the environment for our environment to preserve us. I think we all deserve that good chance to life. I think our kids, their kids, their kids, and so on, all of them deserve a good chance to life. So my message to you this morning is we would love for our actions to speak louder than words. Instead of me giving you a speech, I'm a politician, so I'm not an expert of the environment. But one thing I want to do is I would love to be a person of difference. And we all in this room, we are in a position to make a difference. So I invite you to together, let's make that giant leap for mankind. Thank you.
Very, very fine grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder. Ground mass is very fine. I'm going to step off the limb. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful from here, Neil. It has a stark beauty all its own.
Thank you, Minister Glamour Cruz. Masha danki. Distinguished guests, let's welcome Alfredo Coleman, Director of Web, for his presentation.
Prime Minister, Minister Glembe Kroes, Minister Jetten from the Netherlands, all other ministers, attendees from different countries. Good morning. My name is Alfredo Koolman. I'm the CEO of Web Aruba NV, and I want to share with you this morning the efforts we have done the last couple of years on Aruba in getting more efficiency, but also on the renewable path, what we have achieved the last couple of years. I'm supposed to have what we call in Dutch a clicker here, but I don't have it, so I'll be saying next every time. Next, please. I think we have the outline. That's pretty snappy because I have the same time slot as Minister Glembe Kroes, so I have to be snappy on this presentation. First, something about the organization and also alignment with the national strategic plans of our island. I will put attention on the future energy mix. And finally, I will also touch the challenges and opportunities on our island. Next. Our organization, Web Aruba NV, is the provider of drinking water and energy for our island, and also the distribution of drinking water. Our mission is we provide the best water, energy, and related products and services in the most reliable, affordable, and sustainable way. Our vision is cleaner, greener, and fuel oil-free towards a sustainable water and energy production and supply, delivering the highest value to our customers. All our shares are owned by our Aruban government, Utilities Aruba. We have a sister company, NV Elmar, which distributes the electricity. Next. I think the left side of the slide I don't have to present to you because you have been here a couple of days already. We are a small island. We depend on tourism as our major economic activity. What I want to emphasize is that Aruba is an island where we are committed to sustainable development and green energy. That's very important, and we have sustainable energy in abundance, a lot of sun and a lot of wind. Our company already exists for more than 90 years. We have been producing drinking water for the island since 1932, and since the end of the 50s, we also produce energy for the island at our present location at Balashi, in the central part of the island. Our core services are leading water and energy production company for Aruba. We produce approximately 36 million liters of potable water per day, and our average energy production is 106 megawatt at that level. At peak level, we can reach about 130 megawatts. A very important milestone recently is that we took the old steam power plant out of service and replaced it with a very much more efficient plant consisting of motors with a capacity of more than 100 megawatts. Later on, I will emphasize this milestone in our efforts to be more efficient. Next, please. Our goals, I have to emphasize, they are very much aligned with, of course, with the goals of our nation. And as I mentioned before, our vision is to be cleaner, greener, and fuel oil-free towards a sustainable water and energy supply, delivering the highest value to our customers. That's our vision. Instead of going on all what is written here, I want to emphasize that part of greener, and we want to reach that through renewable energy. And HFO-free, we reduced our HFO consumption over the last 18 years considerably by using efficient production units. And finally, at the bottom, you see a very important part is whatever we do, we have to ensure that we also transform our organization in order to make our organization future-proof. And for that, we use outside support from North America and the Netherlands and elsewhere. About the goals, I think gradually you get the sense of our objectives here on the island is we want to be fuel oil-free. We want to have sustainable energy production at 35% in 2026 and at 50% in 2030. Also very important is focus on sustainable customer service. and present options to consumers for water and energy services. And I emphasize again, people have to do this, so we have to guarantee that we have a future-proof organization. As I mentioned before, our strategic goals are all aligned with our national strategic plans. I can mention a couple of them. We are aligned with the national mission and vision, which is based on the Sustainable Development Goal number 7. We are aligned with the national energy policy, which entails a reduction of CO2 emissions by minimal 45% from 2010 to 2030, and also increase energy efficiency of households, businesses by at least 15% from 2020 to 2030. We have our own leading principles at the company, which is based on reliability, affordability, sustainable, and safe. Next, please. This is a graph which represents the efforts we have been doing on Aruba over the last 18 years in order to be less dependent of HFO. And we could accomplish this by using more efficient production units, such as motors, reset motors, reciprocating engines, which use about 35% less than the thermal plants, and also seawater reverse osmosis. And that is the water plant, which uses about a quarter of the thermal plants. Of course, we don't have to forget the wind park, which has been operational since 2009, major contribution to the reduction in heavy fuel oil, and also solar park since 2018. And recently, the plant I just mentioned before that replaced the old steam plant, with that effort, we were able to reduce the use of heavy fuel oil with 1,000 barrels per day. And we will keep on reducing the heavy fuel oil, use of heavy fuel oil, by transforming into the use of natural gas, which will be realized in the coming 2 to 3 years. I want to emphasize that this is a major result for the efficiency of the operation we do. More important is that we have done all of these transformations with the same number of employees. It's about 300 employees. And I can say that based on a recent audit by PricewaterhouseCoopers out of the Netherlands, we have one of the highest produced drinking water per full-time employee and produced energy per full-time employee of the region. So that's remarkable for the efforts we have done the last 2 decades. Next, please. Very important is the plans that we have for the renewable energy. I mentioned before, production level at 50%. That requires that we have to convert our old motors to natural gas. The latest plant is already gas ready. We will be building a new wind park at Rincon with a capacity of 45 megawatts. Repowering of the present wind park to bring the capacity from 30 to 45 megawatts. To expand the solar park at the southeast side of Aruba with an additional 50 megawatts. And also very important, you need to have energy storage. And we will be building a new energy storage at the same site as the solar park with a capacity of 15 megawatt hours. All of this has to be interconnected through central substation and also interconnecting feeders so that we can transport the energy to where it is needed. And that's mostly in the western part of the island. I want to emphasize that through these projects, we can achieve the CO2 reduction according to the national goal and 50% renewable energy in 2030. And it represents the best option for the consumers. Next, please. Of course, we know challenges. Being an island, we are not used to anything else. We are talking about considerable investments here over the next 5 years. In the power sector, we're talking about 220 million guilders. In the water sector, we're talking about 180 million guilders. That's a substantial amount for a company as ours. What I can mention is we have financial limitations. Our financial capacity for simultaneous projects like these in the power and the water sector knows its limits, and that's the reason why we go also for power as well as water. We go through independent producers. We have a preference to do those projects by ourselves, because the reason for that is because we can present a better option to the consumers. The geopolitical situation, war in Ukraine, doesn't make it easier for us. It even further limits our financial capacity because it impacts the fuel market. About opportunities, I think that through cooperation, pursue access to subsidies, funds, low-interest loans, and view that Aruba is dedicated to a more sustainable island and thus contributing to the region and the world in dealing with climate change. It is obvious that the necessary investments are considerable, and without the necessary support, this will translate in relatively higher tariffs for our small community. We applaud this conference to catalyze this necessary cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alfredo Coleman, for your presentation. Thank you, Alfredo Coleman, for your presentation. Distinguished guests, let's welcome Taco de Vries for his presentation on wind farm from e-mobility's sustainable energy transition expert.
Good morning. I'm not much of a protocol guy, so I say, dear very important people, thank you for being here, because otherwise I would not know the order. I have a very Dutch name, so I am Dutch by birth, but I reside for the last 25 plus years in the United States and do there very much all things energy transition related. So I was hired by Aruba to assess the Rincon wind farm in terms of sustainability, in terms of the solutions presented. There were about 12 that were presented, so I built a framework for that and I did an assessment. I could talk about that. But I thought more what I can talk about is the overall energy transition and things that are happening in there, especially now in the United States. So you can go next slide. So I put lots of pictures of beaches in there because I was inspired by Aruba. So a little bit of the global net zero outlook. I know you're policy wonk, so I probably preach to the choir. But next slide, please. Yeah, we created this problem, right? We know that. And I always say our little blue dot will be okay. The problem will be us. Because if we let this problem subside or control us, we will get fires, floods, and you name it, and we will no longer be there at some point. So is it better to do that? Okay. All right. So we're on a pathway, but the pathway is checkered with lots of roadblocks. And I think from a technology perspective, the world I reside in, it's not so hard to solve. What's hard to solve is institutions that have been there for a century, like the fossil fuel industry, and it's clouding our pathways and not making it very easy and making it difficult for us to find the right pathway. So we need to go through that, because in the end, there's not much technology risk associated with the energy transition, because what do? It's wind. It's sunlight. Okay, now I feel like Elvis. So, yeah, of course the islands will get the climatic catastrophic impact first, right? Yeah, you have nowhere to go. You have big beaches. You have the sea there. Sea levels rising. All kinds of negative effects that are rising very quickly. So, but you know, my insight is like, and I'm seeing that in the U.S. very clearly. The technology is not the problem. The problem is the pathway. And that would be probably one of the messages I would give. You have a lot to tailgate on, right? United States is committing $2 trillion over the next 10, 15 years to an energy transition. It's the largest transition since the Second World War that's being financed. So I think the message is to tailgate as much as possible because prices will come down, things will scale very rapidly. So that means that solutions are consumable for islands such as you. Okay, go to the next one. Oh, we can go to the next one, yeah. This you guys already know. Yeah? But okay, so why did the US do that? I think a couple of years ago they already decided that they need to be less dependent from a geostrategic perspective of the fossil fuel producing countries. Russia is one of the largest ones, as we've seen increased risk out of that. But also lessening dependency on China and do more at home. And we debated that last night. I think in the end, the Republicans and Democrats got together in the back room and said, this is good for our country, so we're going to do that. And we're going to do that at a scale that's unmatched. So we're leapfrogging. We're essentially leapfrogging. And this is part of the problem. In the US, we have about 30 very large metro areas that are heavily impacted by climate catastrophes, right? Probably the best one in recent memory is the ice storms in Texas. I worked on a project there for Centerpoint. The damage on a daily basis was $1 billion, economic loss. So what happened right after that, large C&I customers went to the mayor and said, what's happening? Why don't I have a utility that can help me out, make me more resilient? We need a resilient Houston. And so we created a project called Resilient Now to really look at the investment thesis around understanding what the energy transition has in terms of consequences, because we're going to electrify everything, right? So everything will be electric. And how can we also make the system more resilient? And that's something I think you guys need to really look at, because when in Aruba everything is electric and the power is out, how is the police guy going from one side of the island to the next, right? He needs to be able to charge. So a big revamp and re-engineering of very large infrastructures needs to take place alongside of this. And I think the United States has actually concluded that this is not sustainable, right? Not sustainable from a climatic perspective, but also not from a livable perspective. All these things are getting bigger in impact with huge economic consequences. So that's what they've done, and they've set up initially the Infrastructure Fund, which is $1 trillion, the CHIPS Act, which is $80 billion, and then the IRA, which is $390 billion. And they also have what's called the DOE Loan Office, has another $400 billion. And what they do, and I suggest you all look at that, there's a website. It's Jigar Shah is the guy that runs the show there, but he is now publishing all what he calls lift-offs. What are lift-offs is how much capital is required for a certain technology to reach a tipping point where the price is such that mass adoption will take place. So if you look at the normal adoption curves, right, the little S-curve, we had the theoretical, let's say, insight like 25 years ago that there's a gap between when your early customers sign on and then you go through a period of uncertainty and then you're lift-off. So what the US is systematically doing in all these areas for hydrogen, green hydrogen, they set the price, for instance, at $3 per kilo, right? Is someone saying that right? Which is the price everybody wants. So all of a sudden there's now a rat race that everybody's going to go for green hydrogen, and I predict that the United States in the next 2 years will become the world leading green hydrogen producer. They're going to do that at scale. And that's something that I've learned as a Dutchie, right? We do stamp management in the Netherlands. We are really, really good at figuring out everything in detail because we're tiny, so we have to deal with each other all the time. The Americans know how to scale. And that's what they're doing with the energy transition. They're scaling really, really rapidly. And the consequence is that you can take the fruits of that, right? So it's highly beneficial for the islands to just tailgate, make the relationships. Americans want everybody to come over, everybody to do something in the United States, or they want to help you. And the same goes for, Europeans were, I think, a little bit scared that all of a sudden the Americans were started really running fast, but they're catching up, and they're going to do it too. So that means that within the next 10 years, we will have the energy transition fixed. Yeah? Go to the next slide. So share of renewables, it's good to see that Aruba is in the same pathway as kind of the globe is. I think you guys have the advantage by being a small island, but it's also sometimes a difficulty in scale and getting the attention of the vendor community. But here in the case of the Rincon, I must say, the top wind providers in the world, they were all very eager to participate. And they were basically in every person's bid, there was one of them in there. So it made it very difficult to compare them, but there definitely is a big appetite to land on the island. And also because the capacity factor that you guys will be able to achieve here with sustainable wind is maybe over 70%, so it will be world leading. And the Vestas and Gameses of this world would like to showcase that, and that's something that we need to take advantage of. Yeah? All right, what else can I say about this? Yeah, I can go to the next one. Yeah, well, this you just heard from my previous distinguished speakers. You have a beautiful setup here. There's good wind, there's good solar. You just now need to get it done, right? So you need to create the frameworks for adoption, and adoption needs to be quick. And take as much advantage out of the outside world as you can handle. So, for instance, for the Netherlands will want to take care of you, has intellectual brain power to do so, and probably also the monetary situation that can provide a context for you to just accelerate. But I think acceleration for me is key, and it means that, you can debate, but action speaks way louder than words. And this is not a very difficult problem to solve, it's just getting it done in the end. Yeah? All right. Next one. Yeah, you know this, and why did I do that? I give you the policy slides that you actually probably created yourself. So go to the next one. All right, so what did I do for Rincon? Rincon was an expression of interest released end of last year. We received 12 bids, a couple of from the Netherlands, but in general from all over the place. And I looked at it from a sustainability perspective. Expressions of interest mean you don't have to commit to a price yet, so there's no price commitments that have been made yet. That will be negotiated, I think, with the shortlisted companies. Nor is there fixed capacity. There were some estimations of capacity, and some did more their best and did more detailed research than others. But they all came in the ballpark as what was presented here before, up to 45 megawatts. Some had proposed the addition of large battery capacity, up to 15 megawatts, and some also green hydrogen. So the way that we had to approach that in the end was, because everybody basically was offering the same technical solution, so you cannot judge all the technologies because the sustainability imprint of that will be all the same. So I tried to do it differently by speed. So the faster you would deploy, the faster emission reductions would take place, so the higher the score. Right? And I tried to then very systematically go through that and see the other things like soft factors like local job creation or protection of nature. If that was all laid out and planned for, then you would be scoring higher. So yeah, I hope now that you guys go into procurement phase and negotiations pretty quick. Timing is right, so. All right, next slide, please. Yeah, what you see is, and you know, can emphasize not that enough, is that I applaud that the fossil fuel, the oil, the HFO, I think you call it, right? Needs to be out of there as soon as possible, right? And you see many Caribbean islands have the same. I know Puerto Rico pretty well. It's also oil comes in one end, big station, transmission all over the island that unfortunately got destroyed by the storms. But here, a distributed energy system in the end, where you have then the combination of the storage, green hydrogen, and solar and wind, and then distributed over your, let's say, your retail customers and maybe even your, I think, your hotel estate. I don't know how they are cooperating with that, but you can see them as actually their own little mini power plants, and there are ways of being able maybe to finance it for them on the basis of performance contracting. So for me, speed is of the essence, and a distributed energy system in and by itself provides you energy security and resilience. What you do have to think about as Aruba is there must be like 4 or 5 logistical hubs that I call resilient hubs. That's a concept that's now being thought of in many big cities in the United States. Like if the power is out and everything is electrified, the system still needs to run. You know, blue lights need to function. So that's a big concern, right? I live in South Florida. When a hurricane hits, you see probably 150 different crews coming down from the north. So how are you going to give them, you know, the electric juice that they need at that time so they can do the restoration activities efficiently? Yeah? So these will actually require a rethink of how your distribution system is ordered and set up. And you see that in the United States happening. There, especially in the e-mobility space, there are companies now that are actually real estate investment trusts, you could call them, but they raise $1 billion and they just buy land at big logistic hubs, and they're making it a full service charging both electricity and hydrogen hubs. So to just go in and they build it and they know that the trucks will come, and they provide you this, let's say, a subscription model for being able to charge. The rest, what the American government did very ably is, you know, they said, okay, we need a national highway system that's electric, so every 20 or 50 miles we need a high capacity charging infrastructure, and they're just putting out the $7 billion to build it. It's completely federally funded. Yeah? So the states apply, and in that sense, the US was also lucky because after Dieselgate, Volkswagen committed, well, they had to pay a fine. And they said, like, okay, what about we put a bunch of chargers in the United States? So they do that. Just Electrify America, spending about $5 billion just out of their own pocket to create charging infrastructure. Yeah? So the market will see a shakeout in there, like the charge point of this world. They have no earnings model that is sustainable, but they have gathered a lot of capital, and I think in the end they hope that they get bought by somebody that knows how to figure out how they're going to make money out of it. But it's a challenge. Huh? When I drove up earlier this week from Miami to Orlando, I stopped at the point at the turnpike, and I saw at one side was Florida Power and Light's charging network, and on the other side Tesla. And the Florida Power and Light infrastructure had 0 cars charging, and the Tesla was completely full. So Tesla is about 10 years ahead of the rest of the pack in the US market, and it remains to be seen if they can be caught. They're installing at the rate of 2 high-capacity charging infrastructures, so complete, like maybe a bank of 10. They're doing 2 per day. So that's massive, right? Because you know all the electrical connections need to be taken place, so they have kind of figured out a mass production process for it, but also the deployment of that is highly structured and super fast. So Mr. Musk must be on Twitter all the time, but he's doing a lot of things in the background that he's doing very, very well. So, all right, we have more slides? Yeah, it's actually, it is about this. It's pathways to decarbonization. I think if you really look at it objectively, there's not a lot of technology risk associated with it. It's simple technologies. It's really simple. They're incrementally being improved over time, but the technology is there. The price points are now getting there. So now it's a matter of, for you very important people, to create the pathway or the landing spot where this all can take place and the transition can actually happen. And then take your people along with you. I've seen also in the United States where you say, okay, red versus blue, and they don't want it. They all want energy security. They don't want to be left out. The storm in Houston was 7 days of freezing without energy. So even if you're the reddest of the reddest guy, you're very happy if you have solar on your roof and batteries on the side of your home and an electric car. Because the next day you're heating your house, right? You can heat the neighbor's house if you want to, and you have transport available to you. So that's what it really means for me. Create the pathways, create the landing spot, tailgates as much as possible, and that's what you guys are already doing. Maybe you can, they're doing that in the US very effectively, actually. On the commercial side, they're banding together. For instance, one of the organizations called CEBA. It's a carbon-free buyer association. They want to buy clean energy on an hour-by-hour basis. So carbon-free energy initiative that's spearheaded by Google and Microsoft. But they in and by itself buy 40% of all the renewables in the United States. So that means they have massive bargaining power, and they're now starting to use that. And they're starting to create tools so you can understand the sizing of a wind park, the sizing of a solar park, and how do you actually do that with easy to use and reuse templates so you can go faster. And what's happening, for instance, in the United States is that they band together and or buy renewables together and or ask the local government for more renewables. If not, if they can get the renewables by themselves and build it themselves. So they're just creating, basically already green hubs by themselves. Yeah? All right, I think that's it. Did I use all my time, or do people want to have some questions? Yeah, but this you already know. I'm sorry. You're the policy wonks. You probably know this better than I do. But for me, it's the same. It's a passion, right? So I've been in the utility industry, which is, that's why I'm dressed like this. It's all engineers. They keep your lights on, but it's an industry that doesn't want to move fast because, things that they deploy stay there for 40 years, so it needs to remain working. So before you can sell them, it takes 3 years, because otherwise they don't trust you. So that's why there's only 5 of these big guys survive 100 years, like the Siemens, ABBs of the world, that are trusted resources for these guys. But they're changing now, and they're all feeling it, and they all want to do it. And in the end, for the US big IOUs, the big utilities, it's probably the investment thesis is a doubling of their capex. A doubling of their capex, over which they get a regulated return. So they're going to be winners in the end, no matter how fast or slow they go. Yeah? So, but they're speeding up because they're seeing that they can deploy more capital, and hence their shareholders are happy that they're getting a return on that. Yeah? All right, any questions?
Sure, thank you so much. I missed some of your presentation, but thank you. Just wanted to know if you could speak to storage in terms of the models for deployment. There's quite a bit of, well, it's more than an opportunity for us, it's a necessity in terms of distributive side. But the question is about the models, business model in terms of the cost recovery, the tariff, and so on, especially on the distributive side. Do you have any insight there and experience?
Well, if you're the utility, if you buy the storage, then it becomes a regulated asset, and you get a regulated return on that. But yeah, it will be required for basically balancing, because you have intermittency of the renewables. That's not going to go away. If you have green hydrogen that you can fill up during hours where the energy consumption is low, then you can release that energy when energy is more needed. But for the rest, I think there's what you see in Europe and the US, there's all kinds of business models around that, performance-based or, lease constructions. All of them are available. So I think you need to see what is best for the utility as a whole. I think for you guys, it seems to me that as you already have so much solar and wind, you should own the batteries as a utility yourself. And just use it as a managed asset, and that is also on your asset register, making a regulated return for you. Anybody else? See, I told you, you knew all the slides already. That's why you don't have any questions. All right. Yeah? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Taco de Vries, for your presentation. Distinguished guests, let's welcome from Eagle LNG, Andrew Tharp, Director of Business Development, for his presentation.
Bon dia, goedemorgen, good morning. That's an old picture of me, so that's funny to see. Madam Prime Minister, Minister Yetten, Minister Cruz, distinguished dignitaries, guests, I'm very, very thrilled to be here joining you all today on such a momentous occasion. Minister Cruz, as a native Houstonian, the callback to the eagle has landed also resonated with me. But on behalf of Sean Lalani, our president, he wishes he could be here with us. The entire Eagle team is very optimistic and encouraged by what this conference represents for the future of Aruba, the Dutch Caribbean, and the region as a whole. That said, before I continue, there's no substitute for Sean himself, so I wanted to let him say in a few words how much we value our commitment to the people of Aruba, which were made following last month's signing of a memorandum of understanding between Eagle, Aruba's Prime Minister, and the Port of Jacksonville. So I'll let Sean take it.
I've been very proud and lucky to participate in these sessions over the last couple of days. It's quite encouraging to see how Aruba is open for business. Clearly, us at Eagle LNG, we've experienced that firsthand, both in terms of our landmark agreement with Webb, as well as our investments going into the country of Aruba. We're very proud to have this virtual cycle of investment where we're investing significant money in Aruba, as well as in Jacksonville, Florida, in order to enable the energy transition of the island.
So for those who might not be aware, the MOU that was signed last month represents a strengthening of the ties between our shared homes. Our facilities are located in Jacksonville, Florida, and those of here in Aruba. But importantly, it's really extending the post-pandemic recovery that we're all feeling. And here's a great picture. And so it's really, the goal is to build a brighter future, both in Jacksonville, stimulating the economy there, but also bringing that extension to the very important recovery and continued bright economic future in Aruba and across the region. I'm confident that we'll be able to look back together in a not so distant future and talk about the ideas that were discussed in the last 3 days, not as theories anymore, but as realized tangible projects together across a variety of technologies. So go to the next slide, please. So I just wanted to give a little overview of Eagle for those who may not already know. Again, Aruba and Webb and the government are very familiar with us, but just to give you an overview, we're primarily involved in 4 major activities: marine fuel as an LNG in what is notoriously a very hard to abate sector. The LNG marine fuel business is increasing tenfold. Almost all of the ships that are being new built are going to be LNG powered, and so we recognize our role in building this distribution network across the Caribbean. Because of the waterborne trade, it is a necessary fuel, and the availability of LNG across the region, and especially here in Aruba, is going to be critical. The Disney Magic cruise ship, which was actually here on Wednesday, is an LNG-powered ship, and we as well have recently signed a deal with Royal Caribbean to supply them with LNG for their 3 new vessels for the next 10 years. And they have told us distinctly, if we are able to access LNG, we will change our itineraries. So the ability for those ships to change their itineraries and come here to Aruba, to the region, because they can get LNG, is transformative for the economy. Next slide, please. So instead of walking you through and reading you our strategy, you can go on our website and see this. I wanted to point out some critical points. Our primary and strategic focus is the Caribbean and is Central America. We recognize that LNG has a global role, but we also, because of our proximity to the Caribbean and the small scale in which we operate, it provides a scalable solution to transition immediately for the region. And so we are focused entirely on that. And that we directly partner with our stakeholders to build these bespoke solutions that are so required because each island is different, each solution is different. And that requirement means that you need somebody who can come in and offer an end-to-end solution and provide the fuel. So we are vertically integrated. We make the LNG we produce, we will be shipping it ourselves on owned vessels, and we also partner with the utilities in the islands that we work with in order to make sure that it makes sense for both their needs, but also makes sense for the communities that they serve. And the most important part about that is the end solution brings price stability, supply security, with a reliable single partner. There's not a complicated web of people in order to bring this transition to fruition. Next slide, please. So a brief overview of our facilities. Like I said, we're primarily located in Jacksonville, Florida, where we are actively liquefying LNG today and exporting it for consumption across the Caribbean. In addition, we will be building we call it large scale. If you've seen an LNG facility in the Gulf Coast of Texas, where I'm from, this is a fraction of the size, but it's large scale for us. But the difference is important. The difference means that we're able to address the Caribbean market and the region and their needs with LNG as a transition fuel without all of the required capital and at a size that is consumable to them, to you all. Next slide, please. So here's our footprint in the Caribbean, and the map is a little small. But we will be operating direct shipping out of Jacksonville, bunkering Royal Caribbean's vessels in international waters off of the Bahamas to start. In addition, we have active customers consuming LNG today in Kingston, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and Barbuda, as well as a terminal in Antigua that will be completing construction on time later this year. We're expecting commissioning before the end of the year. We're very excited about what that will be for the people of Antigua and the utility there. As well, you're already aware of the Aruba terminal, which I will go through in a little bit, and also in active discussions in Curaçao. It's not on the map, and I'm excited to announce verbally to you all for the first time that we also are in the final stages of preparing to supply LNG to the St. Kitts electricity utility as well. So that's the next extension of the network that will be publicly announced very soon. So the importance of this is that the proliferation of the infrastructure and making the LNG available around the region means that there's both security and optionality and flexibility, which is critically important when supplying, especially a new fuel type, to the region. Next, please. But at the end of the day, today we are a fossil fuels company. But we also recognize, both as a gas producer and a supplier of these solutions, we play a critical role in the transition of not only our partners, but our own transition. And so we've made a commitment to be net zero by 2050 as well as a company. How do we do that? We work with these partners on their sustainability strategies, but we are also evaluating consistently the next best solution that is most economical for us, and also with the technology that we're using today, how to provide that on to ourselves and to our customers. While our vision, strategy, and focus is catalyzing the region's energy transition efforts through the proliferation of American LNG, we don't just see ourselves as an LNG company. We see ourselves as a future fuels company. To that end, the evaluation of these new technologies will consistently continue to accelerate our shared goals to reach net zero. That includes, for today, and I'll go a little bit into the different fuels, but introduction of renewable natural gas produced in the United States that is being accelerated at scale. There's something about the Americans, they manage to do things at scale, you're absolutely right. But also, how do we then take the renewable natural gas and strip out CO2 so that it is purely a methane molecule and becomes synthetic LNG, and then beyond that, zero carbon gas, so that you can use the same exact infrastructure that's being put in today, but transitioning so that there's lowered economic burden, lowered capital cost, but it's a no regret decision. Next slide, please. So I got to go to San Nicolas yesterday, so I was excited to see some of these murals that I'd only seen pictures of, so I wanted to include them because it's a fantastic, fantastic part of the island. So, next slide, please. A little bit of an overview of our project in Aruba. We will be doing what's called a brownfield redevelopment of a portion of the site at Refinería de Aruba. And in that end, we will be also constructing a low-pressure gas pipeline that will transit natural gas, not in a liquid state, but in a gaseous state, from the site at the Refinería, excuse me, I'm working on my Dutch, to then take the gas to Web Aruba for power generation. This is the significant engineering, planning, and all of that work has been done, and we're very excited to make meaningful progress on this immediately in the very near future. Next slide, please. Perfect. So this is an overview of the facility, and I know we have some students here, so I want to make this a little bit interactive, if I might. I want somebody to maybe answer for me why we're able to deliver LNG in a ship, or how. Maybe? Great, I'll tell you. If you think about a natural gas molecule as a beach ball, when you take it to a super cooled negative 160 degrees Celsius, it's the size of a golf ball. And at that volume, that means we're able to put it on a ship and economically transport it. But because of that size savings and in the volumes, it also means fewer ships are being delivered. So the net knock-on effect of LNG transition is that you have fewer ships delivering fuel when they're absolutely critical to an island's economy and energy generation. So the send-out capacity and this overview of this terminal is that we'll be able to generate at peak about 150 megawatts. We recognize that that is not the sustained power need necessarily in Aruba, but it's also there and absolutely, when it's critical, available. Let's see. But what does switching mean, and why is this environmentally friendly? The reduction in carbon dioxide alone is equivalent to removing about 56,000 gasoline-powered cars from the road a year. It's 250,000 metric tons of CO2 that's no longer emitted into the environment. That's important, but what's also important is LNG completely removes the particulates, SOx, NOx, which are actually physical particles that you breathe in, and the elimination of that has been proven to reduce cancer rates, reduce asthma, and directly benefits the health of the communities that immediately surround the facilities that are powered by LNG or heavier fuels today. And I think next 2 slides. That's another view of the terminal. Yep. Perfect. I was provided this picture, but it also kind of spoke to me in a sort of metaphorical way where we are going from kind of the current state and a darker moment in energy and then moving toward a brighter future, and this is actually in San Nicolas. So for the first time seeing it, it was very metaphorical, but pivoting away from who we are and our project in Aruba and how we see LNG's contribution in advancing this critically necessary energy transition in the fight against climate change. Next slide. I wanted to set the stage with a few quotes that some in this room very well may remember. My point here is only to highlight that the critical paths and meaningful changes aren't being made by people in rooms just off somewhere. They're being made by the people in this room today. And why is this important? We all have a role to play in climate change. Eagle as an energy solutions provider, as a fuels creator, the policymakers, each individual person, everybody touches energy. Everybody needs energy. And it's because it's no longer a luxury, it's no longer a commodity, it's a fundamental human right to have electricity, and the electrification of our economy is going to propel us well into the future. But how do we effectively catalyze this transition, knowing that we have such a challenge ahead of us? By working together to develop appropriate pathways, options available, rather than adhering to a singular global linear energy transition. These conversations frequently on a global scale fit around a one-size-fits-all approach. I think everybody in this room would recognize that a one-size-fits-all approach does not work in the Caribbean. And so that's why, in order to be meaningful, actionable, effective, to meet this global challenge, the local communities and the region has to be pragmatic and has to be understanding of the solution that is best for their island, and that it is a mix of different solutions. It's not a singular option. The shared global goal is well known and well established, but each country, region, industry, individual must determine the optimal approach to realizing meaningful local change that is balanced with the needs and requirements, but in the end contributes to the global goal. I think back to a phrase from the 1970s that was coined, think globally, act locally, which was also popularized in the 1990s for business schools somehow. And thinking with that in mind, we can all act in small ways, and those start to build and build and build, and then you have a global solution and meeting the global goal. But what is an optimal approach? I want to be very clear, that's finding the local balance. Optimal is something different for every single person, every single government, every single utility, and that is the most important part. And the optimal balance is a continual change. It's not setting the goal out into the future and saying, well, this is how we're going to do it. That's fantastic. It's constantly reevaluating what is optimal and what is possible with technology advances, with different methods, different fuels. So if we refocus what instead and think about the how, there's immediate action. The technology is possible. And it's unprecedented globally. This has been called the Herculean effort of our generation. And as a member of a generation that is both deeply involved in supporting this energy transition, but also continually affected by it. It's funny, I live in Houston, so I was part of the 7 days of freeze that, where we didn't have power. I didn't have power for 7 days. It was almost 0 degrees Celsius in my house at one point. It was really fun. It doesn't get that cold in Houston normally, but we're affected by it. And so being able to participate in it myself, but also be here with you all and have these discussions is critically important, because it helps me understand how I can go to other places as well and support those communities with the different solutions in order to build towards the global goal together. So, next slide. Everybody knows energy and security and sources have to work together. I don't think that's next slide. But I do want to maybe introduce this as a kind of different concept where if you've taken a psychology course, there's the individual human's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where you start at the bottom of the pyramid, and that's your shelter, and then you work up to the things that are the most desired. I equated that the same way to energy and energy security, where just having energy available, we've seen in the last year, energy availability is a critical problem after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But then also making sure that it's resilient, ensuring that there's geographic diversity of the supply, but also different technologies that are available, because having that mix is critically important to ensuring energy security. Affordability. It has to be affordable. It has to make sense, because especially in a post-COVID world, when we're all recovering and the economies are incredibly fragile, this transition happening at the same time, people are struggling with their day-to-day lives. How do you balance a critical global need if people can't pay their bills as well? How do you make that happen at the same time? And then at the top, making sure that it's green. And while that's the ideal goal, and yes, you have to meet all of the others first, they can be met at the same time. And I think the answer from me would be obvious about what the solution is. Next slide, please. So why LNG and how does it play a role in the Caribbean? I don't think that is any secret. We've talked about what it is for Aruba, but I do want to maybe take a note from the presentation before and say that we as Eagle view our participation in the Caribbean and our solutions not necessarily as having the Caribbean piggyback or tailgate us, but we're here to provide and work as a partner with them as well. Because we recognize that our geographic role and our availability of this fuel and innovation and scalable technology is best deployed into our nearest backyard neighbors. Next slide, please. Again, no secret that it's a double-sided equation. We're having demand growth, population, economic development, and recovery. Also, the requirement to still supply baseload generation, renewable energy, and upgrading infrastructure. This is a bunch of really important data, but the next slide. So, when thinking about what's most important, I wanted to take a look at the global energy mix and what grids of the top 5 carbon dioxide emitters in the world are doing today. And if you look, you can see that there's a very clear dispersion between each of them, where China generates most of its electricity today with coal. We know that that's a carbon emitter. The United States has a more balanced grid because of innovations and changes in technology, but also the different availabilities of fuel. India as well. Developing economies are starting to wean themselves off of these more polluting fuels, or choosing not to. But the difference is what fuel is available and where, is how you get to that. But how do you solve that problem for communities that don't have indigenous fuel production? You bring the fuel to them. In contrast, the Netherlands has a very, very balanced energy mix. And continues to get more and more balanced, but I'm not especially going to tell the minister about his energy mix. But really the natural gas sector is maybe the underpinning today, but it's also, we recognize that we must change and evolve in order to support this transition as well. And how do we do that? How do we bring the advantages of all of this infrastructure into the future? Next slide. Oh, surprise. Before I get into that, I wanted to say that if you look at the rest of the world and you look at how they've evolved and their energy mixes, if you ask the question of where is Aruba today and where will they be in the future, the grid is getting that much more balanced, and I think that's a direct result of the landmark decision between Webb and Eagle, is knowing that the support of LNG coming into Aruba means that these conversations about increased renewables, about repowering wind farms, about solar, all of that can be supported knowing that the resiliency and baseload generation in backup situations is available with LNG, and that flexibility can be supported because of the technology that LNG is versus heavy fuel oil, which isn't necessarily able to ramp up and ramp down in order to meet the changing load profiles of solar and wind. Although, even being from Texas, where we have a large amount of wind generation, the largest in the US, I know many people that would be very jealous of Aruba's capacity factors. So, congratulations and kudos. Next. So, if LNG is the solution today, where do we go tomorrow? How do we get to net zero together? First, the next step, like I said, would be bio-LNG. Bio-LNG is developed from renewable natural gas through the exact same process that we use today. You take natural gas that's brought off of agricultural waste, other natural sources. You run it through a digester, and it's effectively and chemically the same as the LNG that we're producing today. You can run it through the same liquefaction trains that we have operating, and then supply it as a liquid just the same. The next step beyond that is synthetic LNG, which is the removal of carbon dioxide from that. And that removal, then you have a pure methane molecule, which is liquefied just the same and processed and ran through the same engines. The next step, and you'll see here, is getting to 2050. And I think it's very important, and we as Eagle also are looking at the economic viability and the future path towards zero carbon gases, hydrogen being the number one on top of mind of all people. Next slide. Zero carbon gas, hydrogen is critical to net zero ambitions. And I absolutely agree that we will find a way to scale this in the United States, and around the world. Finding and implementing that solution today is a chicken and an egg problem. The supply is not there, the demand is unclear, and the innovation is still happening. It will come, but if we're going to have the conversation about what needs to happen today, we need to start with those pragmatic solutions that make the most economic sense with the available technology, and setting each other up for a brighter future with an eye towards when that time will come, but making sure that we're making the right decisions today. Next slide. I don't need to make a summary. Next slide. Very good. Does anybody have any questions? Happy to answer, but. Good. Oh yeah, sorry. Question? No. Do you want a question? Sure. Okay.
Thank you for an excellent presentation. And I agree very much with the sentiments about diversification. And, well, I'm from Caribbean Development Bank, so we kind of look at all the issues in terms of balancing solutions that fit the country's specific challenges. So I agree with all of the above, and I think you made you articulated quite well. But let me ask this question though. So for many Caribbean countries, the issue of importation or dependence on importation is a significant factor because it means, it's obvious, but a vessel has to come, and if there's some disruption, that's a risk. The issue of the foreign exchange is still a dependence. You still have to, you're replacing oil, it's cleaner, but it's still a dependence. Before 2008, there was tracking of oil price with gas, basically. Then subsequently, there was a significant decoupling. But we saw in the context of the Ukraine war that there was some amount of retracking. So in that context, the risk you have with the price volatility in oil, you could be exposed, some would argue, going forward in the LNG market. So the case I'm making here is the security issue and the risk around volatility. How do you see that in the context of what you're seeing in the market, the supply issues? And I'm not necessarily saying that this is our view. I'm just saying that there's a concern.
Of course.
In some quarters about that. How would you respond to that? Thanks.
So what I would say is that there absolutely is exposure to the dependence on a foreign country when you were considering importation of fuel to any island, especially in the region. The shift from oil-based products to natural gas also means a decoupling from the traditional geographic dependence where oil products are produced. The abundance of American natural gas that we rely on daily in the United States for our own electricity generation, for cooking, for heating, has now become a global commodity that we're able to export with significant reserves to meet global demand for generations to come beyond what we would even need to consume if this energy, when the energy transition that we're discussing happens. As far as pricing volatility, you are absolutely correct. Last year we did see pricing volatility on the global market because of the shocks related to the invasion of Ukraine. That overall, if you were to go back and statistically, you'll have to excuse me, my history is actually in natural gas trading, and so I'll go back to my days on a trade floor where I was watching volatility. But if you historically take the statistics of the volatility of oil prices and natural gas prices based off of the Henry Hub Index, which is the predominant index that's used for exported natural gas from the United States, there's no comparison in the volatility of a global oil market to the volatility of the natural gas index in the United States. Even with last year's change, it's almost flat. I don't even have the statistic in front of me, and I could probably say even with last year, the average was about $3.50 an MMBTU, which is equivalent to about it's about $6 a gallon or less. Excuse me, it's not equivalent to, but but $42 an MMBTU means $6 a gallon. So we're at $3 an MMBTU to give you some equivalency. But the volatility is just simply not there. And the stability that the American index provides means that it's isolating the exposure to the global markets and also increasing the partnership with a stable and reliable trading partner that's geographically proximate. And the dispersion of the infrastructure means that there's further energy security We at Eagle, as you saw, will have facilities here in Aruba, in Antigua. If a hurricane is to come through one, we'll be able to take from one terminal and distribute to the others so that there's no interruption in supply. In addition, it's working with the United States versus working with uncertain global powers to provide fuel that's critically necessary every single day. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Can I jump in? Okay. A follow-on question to what my colleague has just said. While it is true that the LNG market has had, historically, lower volatility, it does not answer the question of the dependency.
Of course.
And therefore, the issue in my mind is one of energy sovereignty. And unless we make that the prominent and predominant future role, we are not solving the problem. While it is true that your solution meets a transitional need, we all know where we need to be is the total replacement. But replacement with energy sovereignty. And so the question I have as a follow-on is, what can you do to help build that sovereignty through developing, deploying, connecting countries in the region to have their own, as it were, supplies connected in a way that would allow for that sovereignty in the future? If not, the dependency remains. And if that dependency remains, irrespective of whether it's volatile or not volatile, you have not solved your problem.
Sure. So as far as the sovereignty of the infrastructure that's required, because this is a significant investment, I think it's important to note that our main philosophy is that while we are the energy, we provide the infrastructure, we provide the expertise, we are also firmly committed to transitioning that infrastructure to be the property and by the ownership of the islands we work in. This isn't a fuel network that we're building the same as some of our previous fuel suppliers. And we're committed to working to develop the frameworks that are required in order to ensure that sovereignty as a supplier to a region that doesn't otherwise have a domestic source of these required fuels. And as the path transitions and technology becomes available in order to ensure local government and countries' energy sovereignty, we want to work together with them as a partner in developing those frameworks while recognizing that this is a transition fuel is necessary today, and those frameworks need to be developed over time in a time when we simply just don't have the luxury to wait for those frameworks to be developed. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew Thorpe, for your presentation. Attention, everyone. We will now take a 15-minute break. Welcome to the Caribbean Climate and Energy Conference 2023. Dear guests, we will begin now with the event. Please make your way to your seats. This is your last call. Thank you for attending the Caribbean Climate and Energy Conference 2023 in Aruba. The presentation is about to start. Please go to your seats. Distinguished guests, let's welcome hydrogen architect Patrick Knobben with his presentation of Hydrogen Valley.
Bon dia. Thank you for having me. Madam Prime Minister Wever Kroes, Minister Jetten, Minister Lambert Kroes, Minister Arends. I think he's coming in somewhat later. And distinguished guests, thank you for having me. It's a great honor to take you on the path to the future. And as Mr. Kroes explained with the quote of Neil Armstrong, it is also the case that Neil Armstrong used hydrogen to get to the moon. So it's quite old, actually. Actually, 3 stages. The first stage was rocket fuel with liquid oxygen. Second stage was liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. And the third stage was also liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. So if we can make it to the moon and back, I guess we can make it happen with hydrogen, specifically green hydrogen, here as well, and especially in this beautiful region, the Caribbean, and on this beautiful island, one happy island, probably one happy, clean island with green hydrogen. I will give you some explanations on hydrogen, and then I'll explain where we want to go to and how we want to do that. And of course, it's free to ask questions afterwards. Feel free to do so. And if it's not on the stage, I can do it also off stage. Aruba, first Caribbean Hydrogen Valley. May I have the next slide? Yeah, what is a hydrogen valley? It's more or less an integrated hydrogen ecosystem. An ecosystem is very fitting for an island because you know where your boundaries are. If you're in the water, you're too far. On land is okay. And what do you need to build this hydrogen, this renewable energy-driven ecosystem? We need some resources. Water, sun, and wind. That's it. Very simple. Okay, but there's more to it, of course, but in essence, these are the ingredients. And so we have abundantly sun, we have wind, excellent wind conditions, as we heard from the previous speakers. We need to convert it, so we need to can the electricity, we need to conserve it into a tin or a pipeline or container. And then we need to, that's the storage, then we need to distribute it, bring it to the customer. And the customer can be in the industry, in the mobility sector, or in the built environment. That is it. That is it. But let's give you some examples. This is a very, very, very tiny electrolyzer. It fits in the palm of your hand. And you can see the black thing, that's a solar panel. The blue thing in front, that's the electrolyzer. Actually, this is an electrolyzer, and if you turn it around, it's a fuel cell, so it can convert water into hydrogen and hydrogen into energy, backwards. And to do some chemistry, if you have a glass of water and you put 2 electrodes in it, one is positively charged, the other negatively. You connect it, a current goes flowing, and then the electrolysis process starts. If you do that in water, we get a cathode, hydrogen is produced, and on the anode, oxygen is produced. You can see it there. It's really simple. I really try to simplify as much as I can because I'm very aware that not everybody is introduced into this matter. But this is the most simple thing. Most of you have had these experiments on secondary school. And if you bring the hydrogen and oxygen together, you get a bomb. It's called a knaltest in Dutch. Let's say a little explosion. very controlled. May I have the next slide, please? What we need: sun, resources, solar panels. This is a picture from the project in Mallorca called Green Highland. Can be a good model for Aruba and other islands. And this has been developed on an old cement factory, which was on the middle of the island. Cement was, or let's say the carbonate was gone. The cement factory went idle, so they needed a new destination, hydrogen, solar panels, to start this economy. May I have the next slide? This is actually more the water containers and the compressors. May I have the next slide? Then it goes into this apparatus. That is the big version of this small electrolyzer. This is about, I think, 5 megawatts. And there, the hydrogen and oxygen is produced. Oxygen is released into the air because it cannot be used yet. You could use it because it has a very high value. Oxygen is a bit of a tricky matter. And hydrogen. And the hydrogen then, may I have the next slide? Goes into a compressor. It's being cleaned because it needs to be pure for fuel cell applications. We call it a 9.5 quality, so 99.99999%. So it's very pure and thereby suitable for fuel cells. If you have lower qualities, you could use it in an engine, regular engine. We have the next slide. Then you put it into a pipeline or a container, a trailer we name it, in which about 500 kilograms of hydrogen can be transported to the user. And by the way, the pipeline is a Dutch product made in the northern tip of northern Holland, so very suitable for hydrogen transport. And the containers are made by Calvera, a Spanish trailer producer. May I have the next slide? Then you go to a fueling station, because if you want to use it in mobility, you need to put the fuel into your car or vehicle. May I have the next slide? And that could be to the left, top left side, that's also a fueling station. It's a bit modern. Then it goes, you can use it in buses, garbage trucks, street sweepers, etc., in all kinds of applications. May I have the next slide? And passenger cars. Left, top left, that's the improved Tesla. It's called Tesla. It's a hydrogen Tesla. BMW, all the major brands have it in their portfolio, and of course the buses. I'm coming from the northern Netherlands. We have one of the largest hydrogen bus fleets in Europe, and probably the world. Still 32 buses run on hydrogen. Works perfectly, works every day. So hydrogen is quite simple once you control the matter. May I have the next slide? And of course, then there is heavy mobility. You see the little thing in the middle? That's what we call a power pack. It's normally, if you sit in the plane, you can see 3 or 4 of these power packs around the plane. One for the power, because a plane doesn't have a massive battery. It wouldn't fly, couldn't fly off. So you use a power pack to bring the electricity into the system. Then you have one for the air conditioning, because of plane, if it's standing still, it hasn't air conditioning. It only gets air conditioning when the fans are turning. And normally you have a third one to jumpstart the engine. And all these GPUs, we call them the ground power units, run on kerosene. But on our airport in the northern Netherlands, we retrofitted them to hydrogen. That is an interesting case for Aruba Airport, because it's very tangible. And we need to explain to people that hydrogen is simple. So you need to be able to walk around the installation, kick it, and see that it's real. And if you have a somewhat bigger ground power unit, we name it a shore power unit, you could actually provide power to cruise ships, making them that they can that they can shut down the engine in the harbor, so there is no pollutants which are unnecessarily released into the atmosphere. May I have the next slide? And the built environment. So you make the hydrogen, you put it in the pipeline and bring it, for instance, to hotel chains. I'm residing in a very nice hotel with a very good air conditioning, and there are many hotels on Aruba and many air conditionings, and they can consume a lot of energy, fossil energy. And if we can make this transition to hydrogen, we can get rid of the fossil energy and make this one happy, clean island. May I have the next slide, please? So, this was some basic lectures. I hope it didn't trouble you with that, but I think it's important to see that these applications are real. But we need to do more. We shouldn't stop. We need to increase our work. So, Aruba and hydrogen, I think it's a good match. And the match is good because we have excellent wind and sun conditions. We have sufficient space, for instance, at the San Nicolas refinery, the Refinery D Aruba. Apologies for my crooked Spanish. And connected equipment, because you also need some more. You need water, you need volumes of water, you need pure water, and all these conditions are available on Aruba. Aruban Utilities is a very good example on how to do that, how to integrate. And as we heard Mr. Coleman, the electricity grid is being made future ready, and these are the fantastic elements you can use to make this transition now, and that's why Aruba is, I would say, predestined to become a hydrogen valley. That will result in that we have off-takers available, the build industry, the mobility industry, etc. And it is attractive for investors because you need more renewable power, wind and sun, and there are discussions ongoing with parties. And if you're small, and you have the next slide, please. We would promote is you start small, so a few buses, a few trucks, a few little things, and then you want to go to the right-hand side, deep penetration of hydrogen in society. I don't necessarily think this is fit for Aruba, but the second one, the Hydrogen Valley, is because it's scaled. It fits the size of Aruba. We need to tailor it to the size of Aruba. May I have the next slide? And there are opportunities for collaboration because we are not going to reinvent the wheel. That is actually quite stupid. True? There are many hydrogen valleys under development in the world. I think it's 52 or something. And I think Aruba can be a next one. On an island location in the Caribbean, creating an example to follow for other islands. Because, you know, in energy transition, it is not about keeping things to yourself, it's about sharing. If you can't share, you can't multiply. That is very simple. May I have the next slide, please? So, what does it bring for Aruba? It brings green jewels. It brings green jobs, because you have to build installations and you have to maintain installations. There are young people, young vocational students here. These are the people who are going to maintain these installations. So whenever you have an installation and it's broken for some reason, you don't have to call, let's say, somebody in Europe, which takes a week to come over with the equipment to repair it. You can do that by yourself. This is also an element of resilience. It will bring, of course, also the green future. So green jobs, green jewels, and green future. The investments which are needed can be done. Wind, sun, utilities, grid, water, all the elements. Thereby we can decarbonize this energy system, which is the element we want to tackle. But there's more. It will also give lower environmental impact. Because if you burn hydrogen, or you convert hydrogen, you have less pollutants compared to burning HFO, for instance. So no SOx, no particulate matter, maybe a little NOx, but that can be controlled if you do something, let's say, with the exhausts. And eventually it should result in a lower energy bill for the inhabitants of Aruba and for the industry and for the community. That's why this Hydrogen Valley approach is so fitting. And new and green jobs, future-oriented jobs. And this is something which is not only feasible for Aruba, it can be done for more islands, but I'm very glad that we are discussing on how to tackle that, and if we can exchange the knowledge in some place, time, and space, we will make this happen. And the Caribbean is a very beautiful region we heard, with fantastic wind profiles. So there is also some business in it, in the longer term. First, we want to have a hydrogen valley for the ecosystem on the island. Start small, then grow. The upward potential is that. May I have the next slide? So, next steps will be to prepare a roadmap in which we consolidate all the relevant information, all the relevant elements. We're on track with that. Then we define and design the hydrogen valley value chain. So sun, wind, electrolyzer, all the relevant utilities, transport needs, so pipeline or truck or trailer, and use it in mobility industry and the built environment. Then we are going to create a consortium, because you can't do this alone. You need to do this together. That's elementary transition, and I think it's elementary in a just transition to work together and to share knowledge. We're going to collaborate with other valleys, because there's no need to reinvent the wheel. Although we need to tailor it for the Aruban domain. It needs to be tailored. We can't do things here which are fitting for Mallorca or other islands. We need to do it the Aruban style, so to say. That will result in an investment and innovation agenda. How many investments are needed, when are they needed, and which is the innovation flanking that? Because you want to improve, you want to also educate people, and that will probably result in a roadmap post-summer, more or less. And then we are going to see, we will look at which month exactly and how we want to come out, and we need to make some trips to, well, Aruba, to Brussels, to The Hague probably, so we will knock on the door or lie on the doormat for some time to present our findings, and I think we need to collaborate as well. And these are the essential elements of the Aruban Hydrogen Valley. Can be done, I think it needs to be done, and it must be done. Because in the end, if Neil Armstrong can use a rocket in his butt to get to the moon, we could certainly do something with hydrogen on our planet and contribute to combating climate change and all the other challenges we have, like energy poverty, like inequality, get young women to work in the sector, gender issues, and make it, let's say, a prosperous future. And I think this is the final slide. So, very much thanks to the cabinet of Madam Minister President Wever Kroes, Utilities Aruba, and I think we visited this beautiful location on Wednesday, Flamingo Island. Let's keep it clean, and I would say join us in Aruba, a sustainable paradise. That is what I had to say.
Thank you, Patrick Noble.
Other questions?
Thank you very much. Very good presentation. It looks very promising. In fact, IDB, together with CDB and CCRI, we did a bit of a study last year about looking at the opportunities for green hydrogen in the Caribbean. And definitely the question is not really whether there is an opportunity, it's when the opportunity really becomes available. The opportunity is there, it's a matter of time. And looking at your presentation, obviously, when we look at the utility side of the power sector is one thing. When you look at other uses from a whole of a sector approach, we're looking at a landscape of multi-fuel. We've been hearing some presentations on the shipping industry, aviation, as it was mentioned as well. So I have a question. I understand you are starting this roadmap now, but what sort of timeline do you have in mind that you think that the green hydrogen could become sort of competitive in the case of Aruba? Sort of a timeline, even if it is back of the envelope, but in sort of a vision. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the question. I think if I recap it, you're referring to when will hydrogen become competitive towards the current situation, or the current situation isn't really a standard situation because of driven up pricing due to, let's say, effects in let's say, the eastern part of Europe. We see that hydrogen is more expensive compared to its fossil alternatives. Well, they're not really alternatives, they're actually more or less the enemy, because you want to get rid of diesel and gasoline. No offense for LNG, I think LNG is a beautiful fuel. It's a really transition fuel, and there are some, it can coincide, because you could also dissolve hydrogen in LNG, thereby making it even more, let's say, compact, its energy density. But so the hydrogen needs to go down to preferably the level of gray hydrogen now, which is about, let's say, 1.5. The gas prices are higher. So there we need to go, and I think that will take 5-6 years. It also depends on the size. If you have a humongous installation, it's easy to reach compared to a small one. But if you have many small ones, this effect will come there as well. And apologies. I think it's also one thing to take into consideration that you can put it on, let's say, the back of an envelope and calculate. But what if you would say that if we wouldn't make the economic calculation, but the climate calculation, I guess we have a situation which is a no-brainer that we need to start. And we need to overcome these price differences, because if we wait too long, well, I think some islands here have a challenge with, let's say, their protecting their habitat and their livelihood. So it's not only the economic side, it's important, but also the climate side, the climate efficiency, and that is something to take into consideration, and that's something which is bugging me a lot, because how to evaluate that. We can do it with the carbon pricing, etc., but there's probably more to it. So I think, in general, in reach between 5 and 10 years. Let's be somewhat more coarse. But if you start now, you have a head start, so you learn. And the interesting thing about what we want to do in Aruba is all these installations can be bought. You can buy an electrolyzer, you can buy a water purifier, you can buy a compressor, a pipeline, a truck, fueling station. It is the integration of these elements which is the trick. And so it's not undoable. You need to put time in it. But the interesting thing is that you can use the young talents to get engaged in that and learn how to do that and try to, well, let's say, avoid the luxury mistakes we made. We have to go to decarbonize systems, and we need to do it fast. And money is it's a very important ingredient, and maybe you should make the ingredient more available, more attractive, and more, let's say, usable for these developments. So what we actually would need are low-cost loans, very low-cost loans, and a lot of it. Hope this is a sufficient answer, sir. Yes, hello?
Thank you very much for the presentation. I had a question on your last point here in terms of the available financing options for that investment to create that value. But you just mentioned loans, and so maybe you could expand on this a little bit more for us. And secondly, in a situation of water scarcity, how do you handle the issue of water management in this process? Thank you.
Let me take some water. Okay, fueled up again. So I think at the financing side, we need to really explain how the business plan and business case looks like and what are the dynamics. So if we push a button, what's the effect on, let's say, the economics of the project, and thereby go into deep discussion with banks and financing sector or insurance companies, etc., to explain that this is the effect. And I dare to say that money isn't really the problem on the planet. There is enough of it. But it's organized in a way that it's not easily accessible. So we need to reduce hurdles. So finance need to be covered, low-cost loans, etc. I think banks are here, IMF, World Bank, that can be made available. But you need to explain the business case to the people, because a banker looks to a issue in another way than a technologist or a developer. So that's something we need to, let's say, overcome. It has been done with wind, it has been done with sun, and why not do it with hydrogen? So that would be a very general question. And on the other hand side, you're referring to the water issue. Water is, of course, a scarce ingredient, especially the type of water we want. But convinced that if you look at the Aruba case, we have web and the utilities, which are desalinating seawater already. So there is the experience. But we need to do it in a way, if this water is used in hydrogen, that it is clear that there is no wasting of these resources. And bear in mind, if you have hydrogen and you reconvert it, hydrogen is released, but probably in a way which is not too attractive to collect. So we need to be very, let's say, wary and very careful with the water balancing system. It's a very important factor, very important element, because without water, there is no hydrogen. You need the water. And there are developments now ongoing which look into using seawater directly, so you avoid the purification, but that is something which takes some years to be to a level which can be used in a professional way and in a continuous way. So water is a very important aspect of consideration, and we need to also do innovative research on that, understand how it works, but also maybe we can make combinations with providing water to people, to agriculture, and to energy. The investments will get lower if you combine investments in the end. I hope this is a sufficient answer, sir.
Thanks. Thank you so much for the presentation. Just one, less of a question and just a comment just to complement some of what you said there in terms of the opportunities in the Caribbean. So we don't necessarily see the timeline as being that long, 10 years, because of some current developments. So the total aggregate demand for electricity in the entire, well, across CDB's borrowing countries, 19 countries, is just north of 6 gigawatts. Trinidad, in looking at their own transition, needs somewhere between 15 to 20 gigawatts of power equivalent to transition. So in 2026, the EU is implementing what is called it's just jumped out of my head, a border adjustment mechanism, which will require that all the products, well, within certain categories coming into the EU, have to have a certain
CO2 performance.
Right, have to be green to a certain degree. This is significantly going to affect countries like Trinidad in terms of their downstream petrochemical industry, significantly. It's a real risk like now. So where I'm going with this is that there's almost a ready market now for green energy that could help them to change the complexion of their products. So there's quite a bit of work being done in geothermal because of the fact that the capacity factor in terms of a supply is, much better than, say, solar. And then based on what Robert just said, we consider offshore wind to be a significant part of it. So I say all of that to say that for the Caribbean, there's really an opportunity that is unique because of the market that we have. And to the extent that we can get close to scale, we could see those price points being reached much earlier because of the set of conditions, both in terms of the source of the energy we have and the capacity factor of those resources, as well as the fact of the market. And the fact that there's a need that the government is really struggling right now as we speak to see how they're going to address that. So thank you for the presentation, but I just wanted to put that perspective because there is some opportunity there, I think, for all the countries in the region to really cooperate and collaborate in this area. And I think the study we did last year has identified some of the ways that we could go about this. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And I can only wholeheartedly support this. And I think this is a beautiful conference. I'm not a politician, so I'm allowed to say something about that. And I think this could be a very good agenda point for the second conference to discuss, because there's this one proverb, in Dutch, if I translate it verbatim, it's if you can't share, you can't multiply. And we need to multiply a lot. So we need to share a lot, especially knowledge. And this is as far as I go. Oh, another question? Sorry.
So what makes the hydrogen expensive right now? Is it the device itself, the electrolyzers, or is it the distribution infrastructure need for it to, like you say, like things that need to be made hydrogen ready, etc.?
Well, in general, 50% of the price is electricity. And of course, the capex is of course a factor, but in innovations that will run down. It's mostly, let's say, the electricity price, and I suppose in some specific situations it will also be water, because you also need energy to purify the water. So that would be the general answer. And if there are no more questions, I would very much like to thank you for putting up the time to listen to me, and in Ruben or in Papiamento to say dankie. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick Noble, for your presentation. May I have your attention, please, for the closing remarks of Prime Minister Evelyn Wever Cruz and the Minister for Climate and Energy Policy, Rob Yetman.
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you so much for your participation during our conference. Damas y caballeros, muchísimas gracias por su participación. Dames en heren, hartelijk dank voor uw deelname. Y damas y caballeros, muchas dank por vuestra participación, especialmente los estudiantes en de EPI. Members of the press, welcome. Over the past 3 days, the government of the Netherlands, in collaboration with the government of Aruba, has hosted the Caribbean Climate and Energy Conference 2023. We have welcomed several countries and institutions across the Caribbean, the Central American region, Europe, and the Pacific. And over the past days, we have had numerous discussions on the impacts of climate change for small islands. We have also had discussions on ways how to respond to climate change and how to seek solutions in the interests of our nations and our people. And let me share with you some key conclusions of the event. We recognize the need to pursue a just energy transition for our people, because whereas we all want to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels, and whereas we all want to decarbonize our economies, we must ensure what this means for the average citizen or individual, such as a single mom raising her children on her own. What does this mean for the monthly utility bill? What does it mean for employment, for example, in energy, transport, and industrial sectors? It has to be an inclusive transition towards carbon-neutral society. And attention is needed for ensuring not only sustainable energy, but at the same time, affordable energy. Renewable energy programs should therefore be geared at both lowering and stabilizing the price of energy. We also all recognize the threats to our societies imposed by climate change. And we all recognize the vulnerability of small island nations to the impacts of climate change. Our common response here is to increase climate resilience for our nations. Resilience measures can be a mix of infrastructural enhancement or nature-based solutions. A lot of knowledge and best practices can be shared in these areas as to see how to realize these measures in the Caribbean and the Central American region. And we all recognize that large investments are required both to accelerate the energy transition and to build climate resilience. It was felt at this conference as well as in other forums that there are barriers to global climate finance, especially for small island nations. Dear ladies and gentlemen and members of the press, the overall conclusion for this conference is that regional collaboration is key to our response to climate change, because for climate change, there are no borders, not among our countries, and not within our countries. And therefore, it was recognized that we must, first of all, collaborate and exchange best practices that work successfully on a regional level, like we did at this conference. And secondly, join forces and build regional alliances so that our voices are heard at the global level. In closing, I would like, on behalf of the government of Aruba, as the host country for this event, to thank all visitors once again for traveling to Aruba and visiting our one happy island. And we hope that you have had a memorable stay in Aruba, and of course, we would like to welcome you back some other day. I would like to extend special words of gratitude to the government of the Netherlands for cooperating with us on the organization of this conference. And I speak on behalf of all the ministers of Cabinet Waiver Cruz from Aruba, we are particularly grateful to you, Rob, Minister of Energy and Climate, Mr. Rob Jetten, not only to serve as co-host for this conference, but your enthusiasm and willingness to support small island nations goes far beyond your own country and can now be felt in the Caribbean and Central American region as well. And let's give him a round of applause. And I already look forward to the second Caribbean Climate and Energy Conference, and I hope that then we can see the real progress on everything that has been discussed here in Aruba. Thank you very much. Muchísimas gracias. Dank u wel. Masha dank.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister Waiver Cruz. Masha danki to you as well, because I think it was just a year ago when the Prime Minister was visiting the Netherlands that we had the first idea to organize an event for the islands of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And eventually we organized the first ever Caribbean Climate and Energy Conference. So I would like to say a big thank you to you, Prime Minister, to come up with this idea, and a big thank you to everyone behind the scenes organizing this event. There has been a wonderful event here in this venue, but also everything we've done in the evenings, in the night, and probably also later today with the carnival. It was a true experience of Aruba, so thank you very much, and thank you to everyone who organized it. I would like to give a big hand to everyone who did that. So we are almost through this first ever Caribbean Climate and Energy Conference, and I'm quite happy to hear that some of you are already debating who's going to organize next year's event. So looking forward to the location of that and exploring more Caribbean islands. It has been a fruitful couple of days, and first of all, on the first day of this conference, we intensified the cooperation within the Kingdom of the Netherlands. It was very fruitful discussions with one kingdom, 4 countries and 6 islands, and we've signed agreements between the Netherlands and Aruba, the Netherlands and St. Martin. We will do that next week with the Netherlands and Curaçao, to intensify our investments in the rollout of renewable and affordable energy for the people of these islands. And I'm also particularly pleased that we've decided that we will organize regular Vierlanden-overleggen, so that is consultations with the 4 countries within the kingdom to really make sure that this was not a one-time event, but that we really follow up on everything that we discussed, and we will present a roadmap for decarbonization on all islands later this year. But secondly, and that was I think most important, is the focus yesterday and today on the important topics that all small island development states face. A just energy transition, building resilient ecosystems and creating the financial architecture to allow islands to get access to finance without having to go through these endless bureaucratic procedures. And one thing became crystal clear. This can only work if the preconditions are in order, such as sufficient capacity and access to reliable data. It's imperative that we cooperate on these issues by pooling resources, creating regional or even global institutions, and developing strategies that are tailor-made to the needs of small island states. And when I look back on this conference, I am optimistic that it can serve as a stepping stone towards more and closer cooperation on the important topic of climate change in general, but also in particularly for the Caribbean region. Because while most islands might not have a big carbon footprint, the challenges regarding affordability of energy, the protection of vulnerable ecosystems, and improving resilience are both great and urgent. You, as small island states, are on the front line of climate change. And therefore, like many of us said, a holistic approach is needed, an approach that does justice to the knowledge that is already available in local communities, an approach that not only addresses the challenges regarding climate change, but also improves the socio-economic challenges on the islands. And an approach that not only focuses on renewable energy, but also on strengthening resilience and adopting sustainable practices. And I invite you to work with us towards developing this tailor-made approach for small island states. And let's bring these approaches to the UN, to the European Union, to financial institutions and other relevant organizations, so that islands that are already on the front line of climate change finally get the climate justice they deserve. And I would like to thank you all for sharing your ideas and best practices with us. I've heard many concrete ideas to further the climate and energy agenda on small islands in this region. And one remark that was shared during the conference struck me in particular. Nature and climate are at the heart of every island. It's the soul of every island. And I can say that based on my visits to the islands this week, I can confirm this, and I have experienced it myself. And my response to that remark is, let's add sustainability to that, so that over the coming years we can say nature, culture, and sustainability are at the heart of every island and part of the soul of every island. And I'm deeply motivated as Minister for Climate and Energy on behalf of the Netherlands to stay committed to this work and to support you in achieving this goal. So thank you very much, masha danki, and see you soon.
Okay. Hi, I'm a local journalist working for Caribbean Network, and I have just informed me I only can ask one question. So then I have to look at my questions here, which are more important. Yeah, maybe I just like to tell you that I have a little bit of a deja vu here, because in 2010, so 13 years ago, I was standing here in Renaissance, and it was the first Green Aruba conference with Al Gore talking about energy and all the other things, renewables, and all the things I've heard here. And then after all those years, not much. And also there were a lot of islands there represented, and there were a lot of talks. So then I come here, and this is the last day I can attend, because I wasn't invited the other days, and I didn't see a lot of NGOs here. I did see somebody from the Red Cross there, I see students, I see everybody, but I see a lot of people that can also participate, especially if we're talking about inclusive, and it has to come from the bottom up, not only from government down. So my question is, why is that being, and not like before, that this is like a conference, and why aren't like results yet? So how can I believe that now the results are coming, and that they're coming soon? Because the climate change is already here, we're already suffering from it.
Yeah, thank you, Sharina. There are a lot of differences if you look back at 2010 and now. The main difference is the commitment. When you organize a conference, and this conference is the Caribbean Climate and Energy Conference, it's the first Caribbean Climate and Energy Conference. First of all, because we realized that for the vision of Aruba that was included in the energy vision, the national energy policy for Aruba, for us to be successful in implementing it, we need to collaborate with other nation islands similar to Aruba. So that is why we chose this format. That is one. The second important difference is that Aruba, and I can speak for Aruba, because one of the conclusions is that change has to start from within. Aruba has changed its way to view the transition of energy to sustainable. Is being carried by all the stakeholders on the island. We have had 3 energy summits where all stakeholders were gathered and involved, and the national energy policy is now being sustained by all the stakeholders, and that is the main difference if you compare with a couple of years ago. We have realized that if you want to reach the goals, you need everybody to reach it with you. And that is what we have done, and that is the main difference, and that's why I'm convinced that out of these conferences, much more will come out. Like Minister Riatten already said, we have the support of the Netherlands, which is very important. There will be vierlanden overleggen, so this in the context of the kingdom will not stay like it is and then continue next year at the next conference, but there will be tussentijdse, if you can say it, vier landen overleggen. Those are meetings, conferences between the 4 countries in the kingdom to continue working on the conclusions and the commitments of this conference that is within the context of the kingdom, so we will be more successful in presenting our results at the next Caribbean Climate and Energy Conference. And during the first press conference when we were sitting here, Minister Rietten also announced that the Netherlands will make funds available. We will have access to funds. Even the amount of 100 million euros was mentioned, and that is also a very big difference with a couple of years ago. So there are a lot of similarities, of course, because this discussion is not from today. It's not the first time we're having this discussion in Aruba, but this will be the turning point into actions. Thank you.
And maybe if I can add one thing, I think my experience over the past 2 years is that small island states have become so much more vocal on the international level. Marshall Islands is here as one great example. You can't attend a UN conference without small island states taking the stage and just making sure that each and everyone in the room understands the vulnerability and the urgentness of climate change on small islands. So I was particularly pleased that not only the US is here, but also Mexico, Spain, several bigger countries from Europe and Northern America that can play a leading role in supporting small island states. We know that Australia and New Zealand are doing the same with the Pacific SIDS at the moment. So, and with the financial institutions also present, that made a real change of mindset over the past few years that sustainability needs to be at the heart of all investments. So this is, I think, a true window of opportunity to deliver. But I agree with you, it's wonderful to have a conference and to have great discussions and great intentions. But now in the upcoming year, it's up to us as policymakers and decision makers to really deliver for the people of our islands.
Thank you. I've just heard I can ask more questions. So, one question is a small question, talking about the funding, and is like an LNG project also a possibility to get funding in this context?
Well, what I announced yesterday is that the Netherlands will give the opportunity to Curaçao, Aruba and Sint Maarten to access 100 million euros from the National Growth Fund. That is funding for sustainable investments, not fossil investments, but as we've heard today, we will also need a transitional phase of energy projects on small island states, but I think those investments, as here on Aruba, can be made by the countries themselves, but we are very willing to also step up the investments on sustainable and broadening the economic growth of the islands.
So that's a yes or a no?
For LNG, it's a no.
Okay.
But I already told you that yesterday, so...
Okay. No, I didn't specifically ask, that's why I'm asking it now, yes or no. I didn't get that yesterday, I'm sorry. But the other question is, we saw examples today, actually it was focused on energy, not necessarily climate, but solutions. And I was asking myself, we see the solutions coming from America, countries like that, and I was wondering how about the Caribbean initiatives, because it's a little bit strange as islands, we don't have the big carbon footprint. That's the other ones, like Holland in the kingdom, if you look at that. Yeah. So actually the smaller islands are the victims. And I was wondering, why do we need the examples from those big polluters coming here and doing business, and they're not more like solutions coming from the Caribbean? Because there's also a lot of expertise here.
Yeah, that's... May I go first, Prime Minister? Because I think that is why I highlighted that in my speech just now, that the local solutions are crucial. And we've shared some very wonderful examples. For example, the restoration of mangrove forests on islands with local knowledge to protect islands against rising sea levels. Or a great example from the Marshall Islands, where solar projects are combined with sport facilities so that you have also social investment on the island. Example from Aruba, improving water treatment and combining it with rainwater storage on the island so that you can have more greeneries and have improved nature reserves. So I think those are the kind of solutions that are locally known, Caribbean solutions for Caribbean problems, and then it's up to us, the bigger and polluting and donating countries, to make sure that we help SIDS with, for example, reliable data or access to funding so that these kind of projects can be financed.
Well, the only thing I would add on is indeed that, like I said at the beginning, one of the main conclusions is that regional collaboration and cooperation will be the key to success. And I would like to use the words of our colleague, Vice Prime Minister of Curaçao, here present. We do not feel we are victims, we are solution seekers. Thank you.
Very good.
Hi, I'm Melissa Stamper. I'm a freelance journalist on Aruba, and I have a couple of questions. The first one, was there a guideline from the best practices that were talked about today? What could be said that was one thing that all the islands could actually agree on, that that's one of the main things that every single island has in common?
I think what was, and it was mainly also yesterday during the discussions, how can we make sure that each and every island can make use of the best practices of other islands? Because you don't have the capacity to do it all yourself, or you're getting into a hurricane season, so focus is on different topics. So how can we share the policies that we've already made and to make sure that we can copy-paste best practices on other islands? And that's why it's so crucial that we had this event, people meeting each other, getting to know each other, so that we can support each other in a more faster way than we've did before.
Thank you. Will there also be a climate policy that fits when it comes to the Caribbean islands in the kingdom? Will there be one climate policy? Because I know the minister has talked about an energy policy, but will there be a climate policy?
Yeah. So the roadmap for the kingdom will be about both the energy transition, but also about adaptation in terms of climate change. So the nature-based solutions that we need to make the islands more resilient in the fight against climate change. So will be both. Yeah.
And do you have any idea when that will be?
We're aiming to present the roadmap by the end of this year, so that we can present it at the COP in Dubai and show that the Netherlands and the Kingdom of the Netherlands are really trying to be that showcase for the rest of the world.
But so I get this correctly. So the roadmap will be the policy, or will the roadmap lead to a policy?
I'm not the kind of minister that keeps on writing a lot of policy papers. So it will be a roadmap with concrete action and to-do lists that we can all work on and make use of.
Okay, and I'm glad you talked about the transition and the adaptation. I was wondering, because when it comes to transition, it's not only the institution, but it's also the people who have to actually adapt to try to reduce the emissions. When I think about the islands, most of the people living on the islands are not even thinking about adding solar panels, because they can't even afford paying the electric bills. So that's a big issue on the islands. So I know that Holland has climate funds that will help to, give subsidies to people who can't afford it. Would that be a possibility for the Caribbean islands within the Dutch Kingdom?
Yeah, I think that is part of the announcement I made this week. Not only the 100 million from the National Growth Fund, but also access to our subsidy scheme for renewable energies. That is also the way that we've invested over $35 million on Bonaire, Saba and Statia last year. And the projects that we announced in August are being built right now. So we can really move fast as soon as we get to the decision making on these specific projects.
But would the projects be done for institutions? Would that be for the people?
I think it depends on the type of island and energy mix you have on the island. So this is the tailor-made approach that we need to seek for each and every island. getting them to 100% renewable energy as soon as possible. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for attending the Caribbean Climate and Energy Conference 2023. We hope that your experience was a positive one and that the information you have gained will be helpful to you. We are grateful for your participation and we appreciate your support. We understand the importance of climate and energy initiatives, and we are committed to working with all our attendees to create a better future. We hope to see you again at the next Caribbean Climate and Energy Conference. Now let's get on the bus and go to St. Nicholas.